Right. Since we're in the Quran, since we're looking at the different titles in the Quran that don't make sense, including the name Muhammad, there are other titles that come up, unfamiliar titles that just we don't know where they are. And Mel, you're going to help us with that. You're going to unpack some of these titles that are well known in Arabic, but they actually have antecedents in Jewish and Christian, and therefore are quite familiar in the 7th century. And it's just that Muslims don't know about them. Over to you. What are these? Who are these Jinn, these Kafirs, these Galuts, and these Taluts?
Yeah, so some of these titles are confusing because they're often embedded into biblical stories. So they're hidden in plain sight, essentially. And of course, you do need to have lived at that time to know who these are referring to. So unfortunately, for most of us living in the 21st century, these are completely foreign to us. But for those writing the Quran and those reading it, this should have been really obvious to who these were being referred to. Unfortunately, when the standard Islamic narrative took over, and obviously that was written many centuries later, the meanings of all of this was lost. And so for a lot of Muslims today, there's a big portion of the Quran that just makes no sense. There's about maybe 20%. One of the reasons why so much of the Quran doesn't make sense is we've lost touch with the earlier meaning. So hopefully this episode today will actually clarify some of these key figures. So with that, I'll share my PowerPoint. So the question is really, who are the Jinn, the Kafir, the Galut, and the Talut? These are often heard of and read in the Quran, but they're kind of odd. Some of these names seem to be used in a really odd way that doesn't make sense. So hopefully this will clarify some of these. The short answer to who these are is these are all top contemporary Jewish leaders of the 7th and 8th centuries AD. So a source of internal conflict. This is taken from A.J. Juice's paper, Djinn and Djinn. The first Gaon of Surah was Mar Mar of 609. A Gaon now, just to remind people, is a leader of a Jewish academy, which is called the Yeshiva. Since then, the Gaonim, which is the plural of Gaon, were in stark conflict with the other rabbinic Jews and also with Karaite Judaism. Karaite and Haran Jews acted as the heirs of Sadducee ideals, which would accept the Torah but reject the petrification of oral traditions as practiced by the Babylonians. Now, I'll stop here before I go into more of this. So essentially what A.J. Juice is identifying is a conflict between those Jews that leaned more towards a Sadducee point of view, who were mostly in the West, and those Jews in the East that leaned more towards a Pharisee idea of Judaism, which was comfortable with oral traditions. I don't know if you want to come back on any of that before I go forward.
But yeah, no, that's good. It's good that you're delineating because we're all familiar with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. What you're saying is they continued to have significant differences. Pharisees in the East and the Sadducees in the West. Yeah, makes sense.
So the sectarian conflicts between Karaites and Rabbinic Jews in Alexandria of 641 AD attest to this important split. Thus, for as little as we know, between 609 and 641 AD, various Jewish groups were engaged in open conflict. And this is the backdrop to the early writings of the Quran. We're not talking about the finished product in the 8th century, but there was something that was being referred to in the early days and obviously developed over the decades afterwards. So the Quran reflects some of these quarrels, and just like the Talmud recounts different opinions, the Quran sometimes criticizing one side, sometimes the other. And just an observation here in passing, the first Gaon of Surah was Mar Mar as of 609 AD. In Islamic tradition, Muhammad gets his first revelation in 610 AD. Might be just a coincidence, but we're seeing how these two events line up, the historical one versus the standard Islamic narrative one. And notice the place Surah, which is in Iraq. The sections in the Quran are actually called surah as well. Is this a coincidence? I ask. You know? So there's a few little hints here. The Babylonians replaced the Jerusalem Nasi, nothing to do with Nazi, by the way. This is another Jewish leader, kind of like the Exilarch, but more typically in Israel. So the Babylonians replaced the Jerusalem Nasi with a number of functionaries or judges, which no doubt would have caused friction amongst those Jews that favored the Nasi. So the Djinn, or Djinn, is the first one that we're going to take a look at. And again, this is from A.J. Juice's article. The Djinn or Djinn are the rabbinic judges. The Babylonians replaced the Jerusalem Nasi with the Ab Bet Din, the father of the court, the Rosh Bet Din, the head of the court, the Dayan, which is the rabbinic judge, which the plural is Dayanim, and the Haver Bet Din, the friend of the court or expert in law or science. The date of cessation of the Simcha is unclear but also irrelevant. However, if the Simcha and the Nasi had died out at some point in the 5th century, they would likely be resurrected at another, in particular with the beginning of the Gaonim. Schisms between Jewish academies over the leadership of the Nasi are well documented in the Talmud. So if you're not getting this, essentially the Deen or the Djinn are Jewish judges, and they got introduced in the early part of the 7th century. So it's contemporary with the time frame of the Quran as you know, given to us. And if we look at this map here, we can see that Surah is right smack in the middle of Iraq there, which in the bottom yellow. And there's also another curious place further up the river Euphrates called Haditha, which makes me wonder, are these two locations the inspiration for the names of two important Islamic documents? You have the Surah, which is the documents that made up the Quran, and then you have Haditha, which is essentially the same as hadiths, the stories surrounding the standard Islamic narrative. It could be a coincidence, but it seems quite a remarkable coincidence that we have now two there. Do you want to come back on any of this?
No, but it sounds, if you are going to be borrowing, as we're seeing, so much of the Quran is borrowed, you also then are borrowing the references, the names for the different institutions, and also you would be borrowing in Arabic the same type of ideas. Then surah, which would be in this case a place, then becomes a book, the name for the title for a book. And then Haditha, which is again another place up along, is at the Euphrates River. Both of them are on the Euphrates River, then would then be taken to make the sayings. So I can see that this may be the answer. We don't know. There's no way of knowing that, but it is coincidental. It seems almost too coincidental.
Yeah, like Surah and Pompadita were the two most important academies in Iraq. In fact, in the entire Jewish community in the worldwide. So this wasn't just any old place. It was very important.
And just look at the map there. Notice that they're both around Ctesiphon, which is the archaic name of what later became Baghdad. Also just north of Kufa, which is the place that became the head of all of the Islamic teaching. When Islam during the Abbasid Empire, Kufa became a place where all the seminaries are. It stands to reason it would be there because that's where all the other academies were. These Jewish academies were all around that area. So if that's where the Jewish academies are, stop and think, Mel. When you look at the Quran, look at all the discussions that are happening. These are theological discussions. You can only have theological discussions when there are large numbers of Jews and Christians to have the theological discussions with, because they're all, even in the Quran, they're all in confrontation or discussions between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Stands to reason. Look where the academies are. That would then understand then why these then took on such importance as far as the titles later on.
Absolutely. You have Hira only a stone's throw away from Surah, which is where the biggest Christian community was in the area. So it makes perfect sense. So let's go on from there. So we have the Babylonian Deans or Djinn, which replaced the Jerusalem Nasi, hence the Quranic term Djinn, and it's pronounced the same, and I've already mentioned that part there. So we have it in Surah 72:1, for example. Say, O Prophet, it has been revealed to me that a group of Jinn listened to the Quran. Now, the Quran could actually be Keriana, which is the lectionary. It doesn't necessarily mean what we think it means here. And said to their fellow Jinn, indeed, we have heard a wondrous recitation. Now, let's just think about this for a second. If we look at this in terms of the standard Islamic narrative, we think these are like spirits, what would it be? The equivalent Jinn would be like almost
Evil
like demons.
demons.
What was that?
Evil spirits or demons.
Yeah, but actually, now that we know that there's a group called the Jinn, which are literally human beings who are judges, now it actually makes more sense. It's been revealed to me that a group of judges listened to the lectionary, the Quran, and said to their fellow judges, indeed, we have heard a wondrous recitation. So this actually makes more sense than the standard Islamic narrative. Now it's pulled out of its original meaning and it's been distorted, You
do know that Jinn are the ones who are listening to the Quran, and that's why they have. If you look, that's why these meteorites are being thrown at them. When you look up in the sky, you see meteorites being shooting across the heavens. They're there to chase the Jinn away from listening to the Quran being recited up in heaven or up in paradise, straight above earth. So here's the reference to it. Here are the Jinn, these judges who are the ones who are listening to the Quran, the writings.
Yeah, so when it's talking about listening to the Quran here, it's actually not even referring to itself, because the Quran obviously hasn't been, as we understand it, hasn't been written yet. This is just one line from what would become the Quran. Do you know what I mean? So when they're talking about the Quran here, it's actually some other document, which is actually, if we look at the Aramaic, Quran just means lectionary. It's Keriana. So even that is a source of confusion. So listening to the Quran could, in this context, could simply mean that the Jewish judges were listening to the scripture. It could be as simple as that. So it's very different. It's very normal. It's nothing crazy. There's no meteorites. There's no superstitious stuff involved. It's very ordinary meaning. So it seems more sensible. So let's have a look at this term, Jalut or Galut. Now it's in the Arabic, it's written as Jalut, and it's pronounced in some Arab countries as Jalut, but it's still pronounced as Galut in places like Egypt. So let's have a look at what it says. This is Surah 2:251. So they defeated them by Allah's will, and David killed Goliath. That's how this translator has translated Jalut. And Allah blessed David with kingship and wisdom and taught him what he willed. Had Allah not repelled a group of people by the might of another, corruption would have dominated the earth, but Allah is gracious to all. Now, if you look at why they translated Jalut to Goliath, it makes sense, because we know David killed Goliath. That's kind of obvious, and you can see how the translator went for Goliath there. But they're assuming too much with that translation. If we actually look at the word Jalut or Galut and look at the historical context, we actually find a more direct meaning for the word, and it's got nothing to do with Goliath. So if we look here, we can see that the Exilarch, which is the Greek form of that leader of the entire Jewish community, the Hebrew version of the name is Rosh HaGolah. And if we look at it in the Aramaic, it's Galuta. And in the Arabic, it's Ras al-Galut. Okay, so that Jalut is actually the Exilarch, directly the Exilarch. There's only one of them at any time. So it's a very specific term. Galut means the Exilarch. So when we talk about David killing the Exilarch, that may have a contemporary meaning. So that could refer to a messianic figure killing the Exilarch. It could be even one messianic figure killing another one. It could have lots of potential meanings, but something different to Goliath. Another title that is referred to in the Quran is Talut, which is the rhyming pair of Galut. Talut is referring to the Gaonim, which is the leaders of the academies, who are also Pharisees. And it's connected to the word Talith, which is an Aramaic word from the root TLL, which means cover. Okay, because the Talith is like a shawl that the Jews wore on their head, particularly Pharisaic Jews would wear this, hence the name Talut. In Talmudic times, this already referred to the Jewish prayer shawl, and it's actually related to the word kafir, which is often mistranslated to mean infidel, but actually the root of this is kufar, which is coverers, and there are 491 occurrences of this term in the Quran. And related to that is actually Djinn. It's a derogatory term for the Gaonim, the judges. I'm going to send it back. I'm doing a lot of talking there. What's your take on this, Jay?
Okay, so you're saying that almost every one of these, we can see if we look back into Jewish material, these are all referred to. We know who they are. The Jalut are the exilarchs. That would be the Arabic, Quranic Arabic for Jalut. The Talut would be the leaders of the academies, and we saw where the academies were. They're all around Ctesiphon. And then the Kufar, which is found 491 times, are the coverers. That's the root for the coverers. I assume what you mean by coverers, what does that mean? That like the prayer shawl coverers or those who cover scripture?
Actually, both. It's a nice word, and that's why they liked it, because it had like a symbolic meaning, but also a direct meaning. So the complaint from the Sadducee side of things, if you remember earlier on, we mentioned that the Sadducees wanted people to stick to just the Torah. They didn't want any oral traditions. So their complaint about the Pharisees was they were covering up the meaning with their oral traditions, all of this, oral additions that they're, building up in the Talmud. They didn't want any of that. So from their point of view, they were the kafir, the kufar, because they were covering up the Torah with all this human teaching that they were adding to it. That was their complaint. That's why they're being referred to in a very derogatory term, the kufar. And the Djinn is just another term, which was actually just a Jewish term for the judges that were ruling in the courts. So this all connected.
Hold on a minute. So you're saying that the Jinn, which you said earlier, is the Jewish judges. You're saying the derogatory term for them?
Well, it was being used originally as just a straight term for them, but in terms of the way it's been used, at least in some parts of the Quran, it gives over a kind of a negative vibe in the way that they're presented. I suppose it's more in the context in which the word is used. It kind of comes over in a kind of derogatory sense, because the Quran writers are basically saying that these guys are getting it wrong. They're taking people away from the scripture. They're adding their human traditions onto the original meaning. That's their main complaint. Okay. I hope that makes sense. No. Okay. So A.J. Juice says that on several occasions in his annals, Al-Tabari mentions that the Raz al-Jalut, i.e. the exilarch or head of the captivity, who was the official representative of the Jewish community at the court of the Abbasid caliphs, and the Jewish counterpart of the Catholicos, who represented the Christians. He says the office of exilarch had been instituted by the Sasanian kings of Persia and was continued by the Abbasids. In none of his references to this Jewish dignitary does Al-Tabari indicate what his functions entailed, and in one case, he even anachronistically presents him as a contemporary of Jesus and Pilate. Now, we can ignore some of the nonsense that Al-Tabari reportedly said, but I think the key thing there is that Al-Tabari acknowledges that Jalut or Galut is the exilarch. Okay, and that's key. So even a few centuries after the time of the Quran, Al-Tabari is acknowledging that that's actually what the Galut is. So that And there's the reference in Al-Tabari for those who want to have a look. So in summary, the Jalut or Galut in the Quran refers to the Jewish exarch. The reference is often just taken as referring to Goliath. The Talut and the Kafir are both the rabbinic Jews who wear their talits and cover up the meaning of the scriptures with oral traditions. These are the Gaonim, plural of Gaon, the leaders of the Jewish academies, and the Djinns are the human judges in the Jewish courts, the Djinn or Djinn. The Gaonim may also be referred to as the Djinns or the Djinn, maybe. And interestingly, in connection with this, the Sharia courts copied the model given in these, and Lloyd de Young is especially has done a lot of work on that area. So
Okay, so this is this is what we've always said, and this is something that's important. We've always said if you're going to find out what the Quran is saying or what the traditions are saying, you need to go and ask not what they thought in the 9th century or 10th. You need to find out what was happening in the 7th. This has been our modus operandi for all of these series and everything that we've done, haven't we, Mel? And we've said it doesn't do us any good to waste our time with the 9th and 10th century. Let's go back to the 7th century. And that's exactly what you've done. You and AJ Deus. What you're doing is you're going back and you're taking these words which have antecedents. They make sense. Once you go back to the 7th century, and when you go back to the 7th century, you will find Jalut and Galut. What are these people? This is the Jewish exarch. When you go back to the 7th century, the Talut and Kufar, they're both rabbinic Jews. That makes sense now if you look at it in the context of that time. The Djinn, these were judges in the Jewish court. They're all Jewish. They all have Jewish antecedents, which makes sense when you look and see what's happening in that part of the world, up north, not down in Medina and Mecca, way up at where the Quran was being put together, where these traditions are all, notice all the traditions, whether it's the Sirah or the Tafsir or the Hadith or the Tahriq, all of them are written in what is now today Baghdad. That used to be Ctesiphon. And Ctesiphon is where all these cities were. That's where Surah is. That is where Kufa is. That is where Hira is. And that's where the Jews and the Christians were percolating all these ideas. It stands to reason if you're going to then pull out that material that we now see in the Quran and pull out the material that you see in all these references, they would be borrowing even those names and then putting different meanings to, but they were similar to the meanings that were always there. They just use them in mocking them, or they would use them as a corruption of them. So it's great that we're finding from the 7th century. This is now unpacking an awful lot of what the Quran is saying that has been a real problem for Muslim scholars and Western scholars today. They just don't know where this word jinn comes from, or salut and talut, and where these reference to the kafir, especially the kafir, kufar, the ones who are covering. So you can see, go back to the 7th century, and it all makes it very clear. Thanks so much for doing that. This is what we've done with the word Muhammad. We've gone back to the 7th century and even earlier to find out where that name or where that title came from. We need to do so also with these other terms. The more we scratch, the more we find. The more we find, the more we shine. The more we shine, the more they whine. Oh, how sublime. It's just, again, if we're not going to call out, if we're not going to cry out, if we're not going to speak, then the rocks, and in this case, the historical references will cry out for us. God bless you. Thanks so much. What are we going to do next?
So so I'm going to be referring to these strange references, the Sijin and Iliyun. They're often depicted as heaven and hell, but it's actually not the case. Again, they've got a connection to those titles that we've just covered. So that's in the next episode.
Okay, until that time, you have the comments below. Come back to us, see what you say, see if you agree. Maybe you don't. We'd love to hear from you. All right, this is Jay and Mel, thousands of miles apart. Over and out.